I'm Becky Anderson, 67 years old, and thought I'd seen it all until my future daughter-in-law called with news that shattered my world. We've decided we don't want you at our wedding unless you send us $50,000 as a gift. If you ever want to see your future granddaughter, you'll pay up. Her voice was cold, calculated. I just smiled and hung up. Little did she know I had my own plans. On their wedding day, I crashed the party and played a video that made her scream. Before I tell you this wild story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you want more truth bombs like this one. My son James was my whole world from the moment he was born 35 years ago. We've been through so much together, especially after my husband Thomas died of cancer when James was only 8 years old. That loss changed everything for us. Suddenly I was a single mother with a heartbroken little boy, trying to figure out how to rebuild our lives while grieving. Those early years were tough. I worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. Some months, I barely slept 4 hours a night, rushing between my main job as a nurse at Memorial Hospital during the day and waiting tables at night. When I wasn't working, I was helping James with homework or trying to be both mother and father to a boy who desperately missed his dad. Despite our financial struggles, James grew into an incredible young man. He was always smart, but he worked so hard too. I remember how he would sit at our tiny kitchen table studying until midnight, determined to get the grades he needed for college scholarships. Every sacrifice I made felt worthwhile when I saw his determination. Getting James through college was our shared mission. I picked up extra shifts and sold most of my jewelry, including my wedding ring, to help cover what his scholarships didn't. James worked part-time throughout school too. The day he graduated with his computer science degree, I couldn't stop crying from pride. He was the first person in our family to finish college. After graduation, James landed a job at a software company in the city. Within 5 years, he had worked his way up to senior software engineer. I watched my son transform from that grieving little boy to a successful, confident man who bought his own condo and built a good life. Nothing made me prouder than seeing how he carried himself with the same kindness and integrity his father had shown. James and I stayed close through all of it. Sunday dinners at my house became our tradition. He'd bring his laundry sometimes, and I'd pretend to complain while secretly loving having something to do for him. We talked about everything during those dinners, from his work, to my garden, to our dreams for the future. 3 years ago, James called me sounding more excited than I'd heard him in years. He'd met someone at a company event, a woman named Natalie Peterson, who worked in the marketing department. The way he described her, you'd think he'd met an angel. Beautiful, smart, funny, ambitious. I was thrilled for him, especially since he hadn't dated seriously since his college girlfriend moved overseas. The first time James brought Natalie to Sunday dinner, I tried not to have expectations. I just wanted my son to be happy. Natalie arrived with a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. She was tall and striking, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an outfit that looked straight out of a magazine. She complimented my modest home repeatedly, telling me how quaint and charming it was, words that could be either genuine or backhanded, depending on tone. During dinner, Natalie asked about family photos on the wall and listened attentively as I shared stories about James growing up. She laughed at all the right moments and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. When she held James's hand across the table or touched his arm while laughing, the affection seemed genuine. I remember thinking, this girl really sees my son. Over the next few months, Natalie joined us for more Sunday dinners. She brought homemade desserts once or twice, and even helped me wash dishes afterward. We had conversations about her growing up in Connecticut with successful parents, her marketing career, and her hopes for the future. She asked about my nursing career, and seemed impressed by stories from my 40 years in healthcare. 18 months after they started dating, James and Natalie came to Sunday dinner with huge news. As soon as they walked in, I could tell something was different. James could barely contain his smile. After dinner, they announced their engagement with Natalie, showing off a diamond ring that must have cost James several months' salary. I hugged them both, tears streaming down my face. My son had found his person, and I was gaining a daughter. That night, over celebratory champagne, we started talking about wedding plans. I told them honestly that while I didn't have much, I'd saved $15,000 over the years that I wanted to contribute. It wasn't a fortune, but it represented decades of putting aside a little from each paycheck. Natalie thanked me sweetly and said we'd figure out all the details later. 6 months before the wedding date, they dropped another bombshell. Natalie was pregnant. They'd wanted to wait until after marriage to start a family, but sometimes life has other plans. James looked simultaneously terrified and elated. I was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. That very week, I started buying baby books, looking at crib designs and planning what I'd knit for my future grandchild. I had worked hard all my life, saving carefully for retirement. My modest nest egg wasn't huge by any means, but it represented 40 years of careful planning. As a nurse, I never made a fortune, but I was proud of managing to put aside enough to live comfortably in my golden years. I had always planned to leave whatever remained to James someday, but the thought of using some to help with the baby filled me with joy. In those early days after the pregnancy announcement, Natalie included me in baby discussions. She showed me ultrasound pictures and asked my opinion on nursery colors. We went shopping for maternity clothes together, and she asked about my pregnancy with James. I felt like we were truly bonding as she prepared to join our family. For the first time since losing Thomas, I felt like our family was becoming whole again. Looking back, those were the last truly happy days. I believed we were becoming the perfect little family. James had found love, I was getting a daughter-in-law, and soon a grandchild would complete our circle. How quickly things would change. The first changes were so subtle I almost missed them. About a month after the engagement announcement, Natalie canceled our plans to look at wedding venues together. She texted that morning saying she wasn't feeling well. I offered to bring soup, but she declined, saying she just needed rest. I thought nothing of it until it happened again the following week, when we were supposed to meet for lunch. Another last-minute cancellation with a vague excuse. James started missing our weekly phone calls, too. When I did reach him, conversations felt rushed with Natalie, often audible in the background, asking who he was talking to or reminding him about other commitments. If I suggested coming over to their place instead of them visiting me, there was always some reason why it wasn't convenient. Thanksgiving that year was the first major holiday after their engagement. Traditionally, James always spent holidays with me, but Natalie announced they would host at their condo. I offered to cook the turkey as I always had, but Natalie insisted on handling everything herself. When I arrived, I found her parents already there, along with several of Natalie and James's friends I hadn't met. Throughout dinner, I felt like an outsider, as conversations revolved around people and events I knew nothing about. One evening, while helping clear plates in their kitchen, I overheard Natalie talking to James in the hallway. "Your mother keeps offering to help with everything. It's getting annoying. This is our wedding, not hers." When James defended me, saying I was just excited, Natalie responded, "Well, she needs to back off. My parents are handling most of it anyway." When I asked James about wedding plans the next day, he became immediately defensive. "Mom, Natalie's dealing with a lot of stress between work, the pregnancy, and planning. Can you just let her handle things her way?" The sharpness in his voice surprised me. My son had never spoken to me that way before. As weeks passed, I realized I was being systematically excluded from wedding planning. When I called the venue to ask about contributing my promised funds, they informed me that Natalie's parents had already paid the deposit in full. The same happened with the caterer and the florist. Every time I tried to fulfill my promise to help financially, I discovered arrangements had already been made without my knowledge. Natalie began making little comments about my home or lifestyle whenever she visited, which became increasingly rare. "This neighborhood must have been nice when you first moved in, or I could help you update your wardrobe sometime if you want." Each remark stung, but I brushed them off, not wanting to create tension. The financial requests started small. James called asking if I could help with a deposit for Natalie's dream wedding dress when the boutique wouldn't hold it. $5,000 was a significant amount from my savings, but I transferred it immediately, happy to finally contribute. When I asked to see pictures of the dress later, James said Natalie wanted it to be a surprise for everyone. As the wedding date approached, James became increasingly secretive about details. When I asked basic questions about the ceremony or reception, he'd provide vague answers or say plans were still being finalized. Yet, through mutual friends, I learned extensive arrangements had been made months earlier. I met Natalie's parents properly at the engagement party. Robert and Linda Peterson appeared every bit as wealthy as Natalie had described, dressed impeccably and speaking confidently about their vacation home in Aspen and recent trips to Europe. They were polite but distant toward me, with Linda looking me up and down before commenting that it must be so difficult raising a child alone. Throughout the evening, they dominated conversations about the wedding, referring to plans and decisions I hadn't been informed about. Despite feeling increasingly sidelined, I tried to maintain a connection by sending thoughtful gifts. I spent weeks knitting a baby blanket using the softest yarn I could find, incorporating a pattern that had been passed down through generations in my family. When I gave it to Natalie, she thanked me quickly before setting it aside later, telling James it wasn't really her style and asking if I had kept the receipt for the yarn. I offered my mother's wedding veil, which I had worn at my own wedding and had preserved carefully for decades, hoping it might serve as Natalie's something old. Natalie tried it on once, then left it crumpled on a chair. When I mentioned it later, she said vintage items weren't part of her wedding vision. Christmas was particularly painful. James and Natalie came for a brief lunch before leaving for dinner with her family. They opened my carefully selected gifts hurriedly, with Natalie barely acknowledging the antique silver picture frame that had belonged to my grandmother. James gave me a generic gift card, something he'd never done before. As they left, I stood in my doorway watching them drive away, feeling like I was losing my son inch by inch. By this point, my concerns about Natalie's true character were growing. The sweet, interested woman who had first come to Sunday dinner seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone calculating and cold. Still, I told myself it was just wedding stress and pregnancy hormones. Surely once the wedding was over and the baby arrived, things would improve. I had no idea how much worse they would get. As the months passed, Natalie took complete control of every aspect of wedding planning, making it clear my input wasn't welcome. What hurt most wasn't being excluded from decisions, but how James seemed to have forgotten our close relationship entirely. There were days when I called and texted without any response, only to see him posting on social media from restaurants or events. Through mutual friends, I learned my role in the wedding had been minimized completely. Margaret, who had known James since high school, called me concerned after receiving her invitation. "Becky, the invitation doesn't list you as mother of the groom. It just says, James Anderson and Natalie Peterson request your presence." "Is everything okay?" I pretended it was an oversight, too embarrassed to admit I hadn't even seen the invitations. One afternoon, I invited Natalie for tea, hoping to repair whatever rift had formed. She agreed surprisingly quickly. During her visit, I carefully brought out the family wedding veil again, explaining its history and significance. My grandmother wore this in 1920, my mother in 1952, and I wore it when I married Thomas. It would mean so much if you'd consider wearing it for your ceremony. Natalie handled it roughly, examining it under the light. As she set it down and reached for her tea, her bracelet caught on the delicate lace. Instead of carefully untangling it, she yanked her arm, tearing a large hole in the antique fabric. "Oh, sorry about that," she said with a shrug. "It's probably too old to be used anyway. These vintage things fall apart so easily." The casual destruction of my family heirloom left me speechless. When I later mentioned having it repaired, she quickly dismissed the idea. I've already ordered a custom veil from Paris. It cost $12,000, but James agrees I deserve the best. The financial requests grew larger and more frequent. James called asking if I could loan them $20,000 for their honeymoon in Bali. Natalie's heart is set on staying in this specific resort. Her parents are covering so much of the wedding already. When I explained that withdrawing that much would significantly impact my retirement savings, he sounded disappointed. I thought you'd want us to have the perfect start to our marriage. It's fine, we'll figure something out. The guilt trip was unmistakable. My son's transformation was heartbreaking. The James I raised had been thoughtful, considerate, and would never have prioritized luxury over my financial security. Now he seemed like a stranger, parroting Natalie's priorities and dismissing my concerns. When I tried discussing my worries, he became immediately defensive. "Natalie makes me happy, Mom. Why can't you just be supportive instead of judging everything?" Through social media and mutual friends, I caught glimpses of their wedding plans. The venue was a historic mansion that typically cost $50,000 just to reserve. Natalie had posted about her custom designer gown, the Michelin-starred chef catering, the reception, and the string quartet flown in from Vienna. The extravagance was shocking, especially since James had always valued modesty and financial responsibility. What hurt most was how Natalie showcased every aspect of wedding planning online, except any mention of me. There were photos with her parents at cake tastings, bridal shows, and venue visits. She tagged friends helping with bridal shower preparations and bridesmaids at dress fittings. It was as if the mother of the groom didn't exist. My attempts to reconnect were met with increasingly cold responses. I left voicemails suggesting coffee or lunch that went unanswered. Text messages received brief replies hours or days later. When I sent a handwritten letter expressing my love for James and my desire to be part of their special day, I received a text that simply read, "Got your letter. Very busy with planning. Will call when things calm down." For the first time in his entire life, James missed my birthday. No call, no card, not even a text. When I finally reached him the next day, he sounded genuinely shocked. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. We've been so wrapped up in wedding stuff it completely slipped my mind." In the background, I heard Natalie say, "Tell her we'll make it up to her after the honeymoon." The casual dismissal of something that had always been important to us was another knife to my heart. Even more concerning was how James seemed to be distancing himself from lifelong friends. Michael, who had been his best friend since third grade, called me confused about being demoted from best man to regular groomsman. Natalie said her cousin should be best man since he'll be family. James didn't even fight it. Another friend, David, wasn't invited at all after questioning why I wasn't more involved in wedding preparations. My world was shrinking. Sunday dinners had stopped entirely. Holiday plans were uncertain. Friends asked questions I couldn't answer about wedding details. I spent more evenings alone looking at old photo albums and wondering where my son had gone. The isolation grew deeper as the wedding date approached. What really raised my suspicions was Natalie's strange behavior regarding the pregnancy. Despite supposedly being 5 months along, she deflected questions about doctor appointments and seemed uncomfortable when I asked specific questions about the baby's development. When I offered to accompany her to an ultrasound appointment, she quickly claimed that only James was allowed. Yet James later mentioned he hadn't been to any appointments either because of work conflicts. One day, while grocery shopping, I ran into Dr. Sarah Jenkins, an obstetrician from the hospital where I had worked. After catching up briefly, I mentioned my excitement about becoming a grandmother. "My future daughter-in-law is being treated at your practice. Natalie Peterson." Dr. Jenkins looked confused before carefully saying, "I'm sorry, Becky, but I can't discuss patients, though that name doesn't sound familiar." Later, I discreetly called other obstetric practices in the area, only to discover Natalie wasn't registered at any of them. The pregnancy timeline also didn't add up. Natalie had announced being 6 weeks pregnant, 6 months before the wedding. Yet 5 months later, she showed barely any signs of pregnancy, beyond what looked like a small bump that somehow didn't change much week to week. In photos, the bumps sometimes appeared to be different sizes or shapes. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. As my doubts grew, so did my isolation. James had always been my rock, my family. Now I felt completely alone, watching helplessly as he was pulled further from me by a woman whose true nature I was beginning to seriously question, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my garden tending to my tomato plants when my phone rang with Natalie's name on the screen. It was unusual for her to call directly instead of having James reach out, so I answered immediately, hoping for good news about wedding plans or the baby. "Hello, Becky." Natalie's voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "No pleasantries, no warm-up. James and I have been talking, and we've made a decision about the wedding." My heart lifted momentarily, hoping they'd finally decided to include me in some meaningful way. "Oh, what's that, dear?" "We've decided we don't want you at our wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Unless, of course, you'd like to contribute properly to our future." I gripped the phone tighter, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "You heard me correctly." Her voice turned businesslike. "We don't want you at the wedding unless you send us $50,000 as a gift. And if you ever want to see your future granddaughter, you'll pay up." The threat hung in the air, crystal clear. "Is James aware you're calling me like this?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. Natalie laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Of course. This was his idea, too. We've discussed it thoroughly. You have 3 days to transfer the money to the account. I'll text you. Otherwise, consider yourself uninvited and unwelcome in our future family's life." Before I could respond, she added, "And don't bother trying to call James. He doesn't want to speak with you about this. It's a simple transaction, Becky. Pay for your spot in our lives or lose us forever." The line went dead. I stood frozen in my garden, phone in hand, dirt still under my fingernails. The beautiful spring day continued around me, birds singing, bees buzzing among my flowers, completely at odds with the devastation I felt inside. My own son had agreed to extort money from me and threatened to keep my grandchild from me. It seemed impossible. I immediately tried calling James, but as Natalie had warned, the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking him to please call me back, trying to keep my voice steady. I sent texts, too, asking for 5 minutes to talk. No response. I drove to his condo, but no one answered the door, though both their cars were in the parking lot. I could hear movement inside, but my knocks went unanswered. Back home, I collapsed onto my couch and finally let the tears come. For hours I cried until my eyes burned and my throat felt raw. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. This was my son, my James, the little boy I'd comforted through nightmares and nursed through fevers. The young man whose hand I'd held through his father's funeral. The adult I'd sacrificed everything for. How could he allow this to happen? After crying myself into exhaustion, I called Susan, my friend of 30 years and a retired detective. Her practical nature was exactly what I needed. She arrived within the hour, armed with a bottle of wine and her no-nonsense attitude. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into my living room chair. I recounted the whole story from meeting Natalie to the devastating phone call that morning. Susan listened, without interrupting, her expression growing darker. When I finished, she set down her wine glass firmly. "Becky, this isn't just wrong, it's potentially criminal. Extortion is illegal, and frankly, something doesn't add up about this whole situation." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. The rushed wedding. The pregnancy that doesn't quite make sense. The systematic isolation from you and James's friends. the escalating financial demands. And now, this ultimatum. Susan leaned forward. These are classic manipulation tactics. I saw similar patterns during my time on the force. But what can I do? If I refuse to pay, I might lose James forever. If I pay, I'm enabling this behavior and probably won't see that money again. Susan took my hand. There's a third option. We investigate. Before you make any decision, let's find out exactly who Natalie Peterson really is. The next morning, Susan introduced me to Harold Williams, a private investigator she had worked with frequently before retirement. Harold was a grandfatherly man with kind eyes that belied his sharp mind. After hearing my situation, he agreed to look into Natalie's background immediately. Time is of the essence here, he said, noting the 3-day deadline. I'll need access to whatever information you have about her. Full name, date of birth, previous addresses, if you know them, employment history, social media accounts. I provided what little I knew, feeling embarrassed at how limited my knowledge was about the woman my son planned to marry. Harold promised to work quickly and discreetly. 2 days later, Susan and Harold returned with findings that left me speechless. Harold spread documents across my dining table as he explained. Natalie Peterson isn't her original name. She was born Natasha Petrova. She's changed her name legally twice. First to Natalie Peters 5 years ago, then to Natalie Peterson 2 years later. He showed me copies of court documents. She's 36, not 30, as she's told everyone. The revelations continued, each more shocking than the last. Harold had uncovered 3 previous engagements in the past 7 years, each following a similar pattern. Natalie would target financially stable men, create whirlwind romances, get engaged, then begin isolating them from family and friends. In each case, there was a pregnancy announcement that accelerated wedding plans. Harold continued showing me social media posts with announcements eerily similar to what Natalie had posted about her pregnancy with James. And in each case, there was suddenly a miscarriage shortly after large sums of money changed hands or after the wedding was called off. Most damning of all were the medical records Harold had legally obtained through connections at insurance companies. There's no record of Natalie being under obstetric care anywhere in the state. Furthermore, she had a hysterectomy 3 years ago, following complications from endometriosis. She physically cannot be pregnant. The room spun around me. She's been lying about the pregnancy the entire time. Harold nodded grimly. I believe so. The baby is likely her most effective tool for manipulation. It created an accelerated timeline, justified the rush to marriage, and gave her the ultimate leverage over both James and you. There was more. Natalie had over $200,000 in debt spread across multiple credit cards and loans. She had been involved in 2 lawsuits from former fiancés trying to recover money, both settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. Her supposed wealthy parents were actually actors hired for events to create the impression of family money and connections. Most painful of all were the photos Harold had obtained showing Natalie with another man 3 weeks earlier. They were clearly intimate, kissing outside an upscale hotel, while James was supposedly at a business conference. According to Harold's sources, this man was wealthy, divorced, and had already given Natalie access to one of his credit cards. She's running a con, Becky Susan said gently, a sophisticated, cruel con that's left a trail of broken hearts and empty bank accounts, and James is her latest victim. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything. The woman my son loved, the mother of my supposed grandchild, was a complete fiction, a carefully constructed facade designed to extract maximum financial gain, and my son had fallen for it completely. What do I do with this information? I finally asked. If I tell James, will he even believe me? She's had months to poison him against me. Harold and Susan exchanged glances. That's the hardest part, Harold admitted. Victims of this kind of manipulation often reject evidence that contradicts their belief system, especially when presented by someone they've been conditioned to distrust. I faced an impossible choice: pay the extortion money and enable the destruction of my son's life, or fight back and risk losing him forever if he couldn't accept the truth. As painful as it was, I knew there was only one real option. I had to try to save my son, even if he hated me for it. "If we're going to do this, we need to be strategic," Susan said, her detective instincts kicking in. "Confronting James directly right now will likely backfire. Natalie has had months to turn him against you. We need irrefutable evidence presented in a way he can't ignore." Harold nodded in agreement. The most effective approach would be to compile everything into a comprehensive presentation, something visual that leaves no room for doubt. Over the next day, we organized all the evidence meticulously. Harold created a timeline of Natalie's previous identities, relationships, and financial scams. We collected statements from 2 of her previous victims, who were willing to speak after their NDAs had expired. Most importantly, we obtained medical records definitively proving her hysterectomy, making pregnancy physically impossible. I made one last attempt to reach James, directly driving to his office building to catch him during lunch. The receptionist informed me he had taken a week off for family matters. When I tried calling from a friend's phone, hoping he might answer an unknown number, I discovered he had blocked my number entirely. Through James's childhood friend Alex, who still worked at the same company, I learned something alarming. The wedding date had suddenly been moved up by 2 weeks. Instead of the original date 6 weeks away, it was now scheduled for that coming Saturday, just 3 days from when we discovered the truth. The change had been announced to guests via emergency email, citing venue availability issues. "This is a red flag," Harold warned. "Accelerating the timeline is classic. Once she has the marriage certificate, accessing his accounts and assets becomes much easier. And if she's already setting up her next mark, she'll want to finish this con quickly." We needed to act fast. Susan suggested we create a video presentation of all the evidence that could be shown at the wedding itself. "Public exposure is the one thing con artists fear most," she explained, "and it might be the only way to break through to James." I spent a day with Harold's assistant, a young woman skilled in video editing, creating a 15-minute presentation that methodically laid out all the evidence. We included photographs of Natalie's previous identities, court documents showing her name changes, testimonials from previous victims recorded via video call, and medical records proving the pregnancy fraud. We added financial documents showing her massive debt and recent credit applications using James's information without his knowledge. The final segment showed the photos of Natalie with her apparent next target timestamped just weeks earlier. The next challenge was figuring out how to present this at the wedding. I couldn't simply walk in, as I wasn't invited and security would likely be instructed to keep me out. Fortunately, Susan had a connection. Martin Taylor, the head of security at the wedding venue, was a former police colleague. After hearing a brief overview of the situation, he agreed to help, disturbed by the fraudulent nature of what was happening. "I can get you access," Martin confirmed over the phone, "and I can make sure the venue's audio-visual system is available to you at the right moment. But you'll need to be absolutely certain about this. There's no going back once you push that button." James's friend Alex also agreed to help, horrified by what he'd learned about Natalie. "He hasn't been himself for months," Alex confided. "He's dropped all his old friends' works constantly to pay for everything she wants, and looks exhausted all the time. This isn't the James I know." Alex would handle the technical aspects, ensuring our video could connect to the venue's system seamlessly. He also provided insight into the wedding schedule, helping us identify the perfect moment for intervention just before the vows, but after all, guests had arrived. In case James refused to listen even with the public presentation, I wrote him a heartfelt letter explaining everything from my perspective. I detailed our journey together from his childhood, through all our struggles and triumphs. I reminded him of the values his father and I had taught him, and expressed my unconditional love, regardless of his decision. I sealed this letter hoping I would never need to give it to him, but knowing it might be my last chance to reach him. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I sat in my garden under the stars thinking about everything at stake. I might lose my son forever. He might hate me for humiliating him publicly. The thought was agonizing, but the alternative, watching him be defrauded and manipulated while being cut out of his life, was worse. Sometimes, love means making the hardest choice even when it breaks your heart. As dawn broke on the wedding day, I prepared myself mentally and emotionally for what was to come. I chose a simple but elegant navy blue dress, nothing that would draw undue attention, but appropriate for a mother of the groom. I did my makeup carefully, wanting to look composed and dignified despite my inner turmoil. Susan arrived to drive me to the venue, squeezing my hand reassuringly. "Remember, Becky, no matter what happens today, you're doing this out of love. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals." With those words in my heart, I headed toward the confrontation that would either save my son or cost me his love forever. The Hamilton estate was even more magnificent than I had imagined. Sprawling gardens surrounded the historic mansion, where my son was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway as elegantly dressed guests streamed toward the garden where the ceremony would take place. I watched from Susan's car, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Martin, the security head, met us at a side entrance as planned. "Everything's set up in the main system," he confirmed quietly. "Alex is in position near the audio-visual controls. You'll have your moment right before the vows." He handed me a staff access badge. "This will get you anywhere you need to go. I've briefed my team that you're a late-arriving immediate family member." I took a deep breath and entered the venue. Despite my badge, I tried to remain inconspicuous, moving along the periphery of gathering guests. Several people recognized me, their expressions ranging from surprise to confusion to sympathy. Margaret, James's longtime friend, hurried over. "Becky, I didn't think you were coming," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "James told everyone you were too ill to attend." "Did he?" I said, my resolve strengthening. "Well, I've made a miraculous recovery." From my position near the back of the garden, I could see everything. White chairs arranged in neat rows faced an elaborate floral arch where a minister waited. A string quartet played softly as guests found their seats. The ostentation of it all was striking. This wasn't my son's taste at all, this extravagant display that must have cost a small fortune. At precisely 2 o'clock, the music changed. The wedding party began their procession. I caught a glimpse of James at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, but noticeably thin and tense. He hadn't seen me yet. Then Natalie appeared at the end of the aisle, a vision in white. Her dress was extravagant, with a train that required 2 attendants to manage. Around her waist, a strategically placed sash and carefully structured gown created the illusion of a small baby bump. The ceremony began. I waited, breath held for the perfect moment. The minister welcomed everyone and spoke about love and commitment, words that rang hollow, given what I knew. Then came the line I was waiting for. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." I stepped forward into the center aisle. "I have something to say." A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. James's head snapped up, his expression morphing from shock to anger when he saw me. Natalie's reaction was more controlled, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "Mom, what are you doing here?" James hissed. "You're not welcome." "James, I love you too much to stay silent." My voice was steady despite my racing heart. Before you make this commitment, there's something everyone here needs to see. Natalie stepped forward, her practiced smile never wavering. This is so inappropriate, Becky. Security, please remove her. Martin stepped forward as if to intervene, but instead gave a subtle nod to Alex, who was positioned near the sound system. Suddenly, the large decorative screens that had been showing artistic wedding photos switched to our prepared video. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced. As the first image appeared, "I apologize for the interruption, but what you're about to see cannot wait. This is the truth about Natalie Peterson, or should I say, Natasha Petrova." The video began playing. The guests fell silent as document after document appeared, building the undeniable case. First came Natalie's multiple identities with photo evidence and legal name change documents. Then, testimonials from her previous victims, men who had fallen for the same schemes, described the same pattern of isolation and financial manipulation. "She targeted me after learning about my inheritance," one man explained on screen. "Within months, she announced a pregnancy, rushed the wedding plans, and began asking for increasingly large sums of money. After I transferred nearly $70,000 for what she claimed were medical complications, she disappeared. There was never any baby." Next came the medical records displayed clearly for all to see. The hysterectomy documentation was unmistakable, with Natalie's name and information clearly visible. The date was 3 years earlier, making her current pregnancy claim medically impossible. The financial evidence followed credit card statements showing massive debt loan applications using James's information without his knowledge, records of jewelry and artwork purchased and then sold. The financial trail painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. Throughout the presentation, I watched Natalie's face. Her initial confident smirk gave way to panic as the evidence mounted. She glanced frantically around the room, likely calculating escape routes. James stood frozen, his expression transforming from anger to confusion to dawning horror. The final segment showed the recent photos of Natalie with another man, clearly in a romantic embrace dated just 3 weeks earlier while James was out of town. The timestamp was undeniable. As the video ended, the garden remained completely silent. All eyes moved between James, Natalie, and me. Natalie recovered first, her face contorting with rage. "This is all lies," she screamed, turning to James. "Baby, she's fabricated all of this because she can't stand to see you happy. She's jealous and bitter and wants to control you forever." James looked at her, then at me, his face ashen. "The medical records," he said quietly. "Is it true you had a hysterectomy? You can't be pregnant?" Natalie's strategy shifted instantly. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched her fake baby bump. "I was going to tell you. I was so afraid of losing you that I made up the pregnancy. But our love is real, James. Everything else is real." "And the other men? The photos from 3 weeks ago, are those real too?" James's voice broke as he asked. Before Natalie could respond, a man stood up from among the guests. "I can confirm it's all true. I'm Daniel Robertson. Natalie was engaged to my brother 2 years ago. She did exactly the same thing, including faking a pregnancy. She disappeared after emptying his bank accounts." Another guest stood. "She worked at my company under the name Natalie Peters. She was fired for embezzlement but avoided charges by returning some of the money." Natalie's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. "You stupid, pathetic people," she snarled, all pretense gone. "Yes, fine, it was all a con, and it would have worked perfectly if your meddling mother hadn't interfered. Do you know how long I worked on this? How carefully I planned everything?" She rounded on me, pointing an accusing finger. "You were the only problem from the beginning. So attached to your precious son, so suspicious. I tried everything to get rid of you. The others were easy to isolate him from, but you just wouldn't go away." James stepped away from her, his face a mask of pain. "There's no baby. There was never any baby." Of course there's no baby, you idiot, Natalie snapped, yanking at the fabric around her midsection to reveal a cleverly designed padding. Do you think I'd actually want to have your child? This was business, nothing more. An older couple I didn't recognize stood up from the front row. The woman spoke hesitantly. We should probably mention that we're not Natalie's parents. We're actors she hired from a local theater company. She found us through a casting call. The man nodded. She paid us $5,000 each to pretend for all wedding events. We had no idea about the rest of this, I swear. The revelation seemed to be the final blow for James. He sank onto the steps leading to the altar head in his hands. Natalie, seeing her scheme completely exposed, switched to self-preservation mode. This is ridiculous. I don't have to stand here and be humiliated. She gathered her dress and began moving toward the exit. You'll be hearing from my lawyers. Martin nodded to two security guards, who stepped forward to block her path. Actually, miss, you might want to stay. The police are on their way. There are enough charges here, from fraud to identity theft to extortion, to warrant their interest. The scene dissolved into chaos. Guests began talking all at once, some leaving hurriedly, others gathering in shocked clusters to discuss what they'd witnessed. Through it all, I kept my eyes on James, my heart breaking for his pain, but relieved he now knew the truth. I approached him slowly, uncertain of my welcome. He looked up as I neared, his eyes red-rimmed and devastated. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stood and wrapped his arms around me in a fierce hug that took my breath away. I'm so sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I held my son as he shook with silent sobs, right there among the ruins of his wedding day. It wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for, but it was the truth. And sometimes the truth, painful as it is the only gift that really matters. The aftermath of the wedding disaster was as difficult as I had feared. James retreated into himself, overwhelmed by shame, betrayal, and grief. He moved out of the condo he had shared with Natalie and stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks, barely communicating with anyone. When he finally called me, his voice was hollow. I don't even know who I am anymore, Mom, he confessed. How could I have been so blind? How could I have treated you that way? I understood he needed space to process everything, so I didn't push. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here. No pressure, no judgment, just love. Natalie was arrested that same day on multiple charges, including fraud, identity theft, and extortion. The police found evidence of similar schemes dating back nearly a decade. Her previous victims came forward once the story broke, strengthening the case against her. She eventually accepted a plea deal, resulting in 5 years in prison and restitution orders she would likely never be able to fulfill. James and I began rebuilding our relationship slowly. At first, he could barely look me in the eye, so deep was his guilt over how he had treated me. We started with short phone calls, then coffee at a neutral cafe. Eventually, he accepted my invitation to Sunday dinner, the first one in over a year. I don't understand how you can forgive me, he said that night as we sat on my porch swing after dinner. I said terrible things to you. I chose her over you. I let her isolate me from everyone who actually cared about me. I took his hand, noting how thin it had become. James, there's nothing to forgive. You were manipulated by someone who had perfected the art of manipulation. What matters is that you're here now. But I should have seen through it. I should have known better. Love makes us vulnerable, I said gently. It's not a weakness to have trusted someone you loved. The weakness would be letting this experience close your heart forever. Gradually, James began to heal. He started therapy to understand how he had been manipulated and to rebuild his sense of self. He reconnected with old friends, many of whom welcomed him back with open arms, understanding he had been a victim. He focused on his work, finding solace in the logical world of software engineering, where problems had clear solutions. The financial damage was substantial. James had depleted his savings, maxed out credit cards, and taken loans to fund the lavish wedding and Natalie's expensive tastes. Together, we worked out a realistic repayment plan. I helped where I could without enabling dependency, and within 18 months he had managed to pay off the most pressing debts. About a year after the wedding, we received news that brought final closure. Natalie's elaborate network of scams had fully unraveled. Beyond her criminal charges, several civil suits had been filed against her. The full extent of her deception was staggering, with estimated financial fraud totaling over $2 million across multiple victims. The beautiful, charming woman had been nothing but a carefully constructed illusion designed to separate good people from their money. As James recovered, he gradually opened himself to life again. He joined a hiking club, rediscovering his love of the outdoors that had been suppressed during his time with Natalie. On one of these hikes, he met Emily Collins, a kindergarten teacher with a warm laugh and genuine spirit that couldn't be faked. When James first mentioned Emily to me, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time: genuine happiness. Still, he was understandably cautious. "I'm taking it really slow, Mom. I don't trust my own judgment anymore." "That's wise," I acknowledged. "But don't punish Emily for Natalie's sins. Not everyone wears a mask." The first time James brought Emily to Sunday dinner, I was nervous for both of us. Would I be overly suspicious? Would she resent my protective instincts toward my son? My worries proved unfounded. Emily arrived with a homemade pie and genuine curiosity about the family photos on my walls. As she helped me wash dishes afterward, she spoke candidly. "James told me everything that happened," she said quietly. "I want you to know I understand if you're cautious. In your position, I would be too. I don't need you to trust me right away. I just hope you'll give me the chance to earn it." Her honesty was refreshing. Over the following months, I watched carefully, but saw nothing but authenticity in how she interacted with James and others. She had her own friends, her own life, and encouraged James to maintain his independence too. Their relationship grew naturally, without the whirlwind intensity that had characterized his time with Natalie. 2 years after the disastrous almost wedding, James and Emily decided to marry. Their engagement was appropriately long, giving everyone time to adjust. The wedding they planned reflected both of them perfectly: a simple ceremony in the botanical gardens, where they had spent many happy afternoons, followed by a reception at a local restaurant they both loved. "Mom, would you walk me down the aisle?" James asked, breaking with tradition in the most meaningful way. "After everything we've been through, I can't imagine anyone else in that role." On their wedding day, there was no drama, no extravagance, no hidden agendas. Just two people genuinely in love, surrounded by people who truly cared for them. I watched my son marry a woman of substance and felt nothing but joy and peace. A year later, Emily gave birth to their daughter Lily. Holding my actual granddaughter for the first time, I felt the circle of our family complete itself in a way I had once feared would never happen. James had found his way back to authentic happiness, and our bond was stronger for having been tested so severely. The experience changed me too. I learned to trust my instincts more deeply. That initial discomfort I'd felt with Natalie hadn't been baseless suspicion, but my subconscious recognizing inconsistencies my conscious mind tried to ignore. I became more willing to speak up when something felt wrong, but also more appreciative of genuine connections when I found them. I've come to believe that love should never require you to diminish yourself or cut off other relationships. Real love expands your world rather than shrinks it. It brings people together rather than driving them apart. Perhaps most importantly, love should never come with a price tag or ultimatum. Today, as I watch James, Emily, and little Lily playing in my garden, I'm grateful for the painful journey that led us here. Sometimes the most difficult experiences teach us the most valuable lessons. Sometimes you have to crash a wedding to save the day. So, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have paid the money to keep the peace, or would you have fought for the truth like I did? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Share this with someone who might need to be reminded that true love never comes with a price tag. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, trust your instincts. They're usually trying to tell you something important.